se ci siamo anche sulla pagina di Lepore.
Good evening. Welcome to this new public dialogue on the COVID 19 emergency promoted by the Foundation for Urban Innovation. And this evening, it is for me a particular pleasure to discuss with Achille Mbembe, one of the most influential African voices of our times and a friend. He is professor at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg and leading scholar at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. He is the author of seminal works, almost all of them available also into Italian. Let me just mention a few of them. De la Postcolonie, Critique de la Raison Nègre, Politique de l'inimitié, which is known in Italy with the title of Necropolitica, and the most recent one, Brutalisme. Good evening, Achille, and thank you for accepting our invitation. It's a bittersweet sensation to talk with you from a video, but it's great to have the opportunity to talk with you.
I'm so happy. I mean, I was expecting to come to Bologna this summer, as usual. We won't be able to do it, but I'm so happy to see you at least on the screen.
We will do so next year, hopefully. So I remember for those who are watching us live from the Facebook page of the foundation, that as usual it would be possible to interact directly with Achille Mbembe in the second part of our conversation using the comment space in our Facebook page. So we decided to have, after the publication of an important intervention on the COVID 19 crisis, Achille published a text entitled "De droit universel à la respiration, the universal right to breathe or to respiration," which is available also on the digital archive on the COVID-19 crisis in the website of the Foundation for Urban Innovation, a text that we consider one of the most original on the crisis opened by the pandemic. And in my opinion, it is not by accident that this intervention has been produced from an African standpoint. And actually, I would like to start, Achille, our conversation precisely from this. You recently have said that after COVID-19, Africa needs to organize quickly a great transition. It seems to me as if this call for Africa actually has a lot to do with the general call, with the general claim for a universal right to breathe that of your other text. So as if Africa is playing a kind of a second side to this global contemporary crisis. So I would like to start asking you from the African perspective and more in general, how this great transition you are asking for could take form.
Yes. as you know, Africa has always, or in any case, has often been described as the epicenter of crisis. Whenever one pronounces the noun Africa, a lot of what comes up almost immediately is one figure or another of crisis, something going wrong, and something going really wrong. In this case, the crisis didn't originate from the continent. It comes after a number of sanitary catastrophes or calamities that have afflicted the continent. I would say over the last quarter of the century. You might remind the Ebola crisis, or the kind of permanent crisis that we have been experiencing in the terms of malaria, for instance, which kills millions of people every single year. Which means that we have here two figures of, I would say, the catastrophic. One figure of the catastrophic in which the catastrophe is not something that comes suddenly, happens once, and then ends, so that we can enter a new post-catastrophic moment. Malaria is such a crisis that keeps reproducing itself and becomes embedded somewhat in the everyday life and fabric of the societies. The other figure of the crisis is what many are working with, which is we had a pre-COVID-19 moment, we entered the COVID moment, and we are now preparing for the post-COVID moment in a kind of historical temporality which proceeds as we have always known what was there before, what is there now, and what is there after. So the transition I'm talking about has to do with an entirely different conception of temporality. Not at all along the linear model I have referred to, past, present, future, but in the sense of an entanglement of different moments, times, epochs, which complicates ever more than ever before our predicament. But it's also a transition which has to do with the bigger question of the futures of life. In the face of the realization that absent a significant adjustment to how we conduct our lives, when I say we, I really mean the big we, humanity. In spite of the differences, such a category of course entails of necessity. So short of a radical readjustment of our lives, parts of the earth will likely become inhospitable to life in the near future. So this question of inhospitality and this question of inhabitability are really the big questions behind what I call the Great Transition, which would lead to a universal right to respiration, if such a term means anything in English. So that's let's say the overall horizon, both theoretical and political.
Okay. So, Achille, before entering more in details on some of the the content of your text, uh, let I'm interested in the theoretical framework that some way shaped the idea of a universal right to respiration. So the text arrives after the publication of your recent book on brutalism, but it seems to me, at least in my reading, a new step in your research. So beyond some way the paradigm of necropolitics. So I would like to ask you if, especially for those who are not entirely familiar with your works, if you can tell something on the paradigm of brutalism and how it fits with the contemporary crisis introduced by COVID-19.
So brutalism appeared in February 2020 in Paris. I finished writing it in December. The term brutalism, of course, refers to brute, but more importantly, it refers to an architectural movement which existed in the second half of the 20th century, especially in Europe. It was called brutalism. It was known for its the importance it gave to both matter and form. Matter in the sense of in the guise of cement, but more importantly in the guise of, I think the term in French is béton. I don't know how to translate it in English, but béton is we can check it. So matter in the form of béton, and form in the sense of that which is not necessarily monumental, but that which is made in such a way as to last forever. The making of that which is called upon to last forever is, of course, a very violent act. You do it by tracking the matter, deforming the matter, reforming it through brutal means. So I took that term from the architectural movement and I tried to politicize it. It was in the architectural movement, it's very aesthetical. The aim, of course, was then to offer housing to the many people who were homeless in the aftermath of the Second World War. So you had these paradoxical movement where you want to attend to people's basic needs, but through a manipulation of matter and forms, which requires coercion, violence, and all of that. So I try to politicize it in an attempt at shedding some light, hopefully, on three processes which it seems to me are characteristic of the times we live in. The first one, we spoke about it, it's the impending ecological catastrophe, which is, of course, opening up a whole set of questions. One, the most important, as far as I'm concerned, having to do with the futures of life. The second process, mega process, in fact, is, of course, the kind of technological escalation we are witnessing today, which is pretty unique in the history of humankind. It's completely new. I know historians love to say nothing is new, all is repetition, but that's not true. This is new. The ways in which we relate today to the technological is akin to something I would call a second creation, using those rather theological or cosmological concepts. So, technological escalation, and the third one, mega process, the turning of the economic into the neurological, that the economy, more and more, capitalism is becoming neurological, that the raw material it hopes to mine in the future and forever has to do with what's going on here. Meaning here in our brain, in our psyche, in our emotions, in our desires. And these raw materials are, limitless. There won't be one moment when human beings won't be beings of desires or beings of emotions. So this entry into the age of the computational, of calculability, computability, is the other mega process that I wanted to explain. I've captured all of that under the term brutalism.
So at the first reading, your universal right to respiration could seem an intervention, let's say, in the environmentalist debate. But it seems to me that actually there is something more than that. That I would say that it has some kind of an intersectional soul inspiring it, in the sense that it tried to connect ecology, healthcare, social and economic inequalities, critique of neoliberal extractivism, racism, enduring colonial logic, and so on and so forth. So that the idea that actually the universal right to respiration, to quote actually your text, is a fundamental right to existence, an originary right to living on the earth, a right that belongs to the universal community of earthly inhabitants, human and other. So how do you try to connect all these dimensions in a universal right, actually?
Mm-hmm. It's a very difficult question, but it's the right question if we want to go further than just the statement that was made in universal right to breathe. But just to contextualize all of that, since your question seems to be asking me also to attend to that, I came into this question of breathing through, first of all, my reading of Frantz Fanon. It is pretty striking for anyone who reads Fanon's overall work, the extent to which he keeps coming back to this question of breathing. He never really defines what he means by that. He uses it at times as a metaphor, at times as a descriptive concept, at times as a key element in his theorization of the body in pain, but also the body under context of confinement. Colonialism being, in fact, one dramatic mode of confinement. Poverty, of course, being the other. Disease, etc. So we can expand historically the concept of confinement in this sense. So that was the first source of my being intrigued by this constant reference to breathing. Then there is the event which happened in New York, for those of you who remember. A black man, informal trader, was selling cigarettes. And he was arrested by policemen in a park in New York, and they subjected him to physical coercion, choked him, and his last words were, "I can't breathe. I cannot breathe." So it was striking for me that, at least in the first discussions around the COVID-19, that at least in South Africa, a lot that was being spoken about was the ways in which this specific virus attacked that capacity to breathe. Therefore, the need for masks, the debates on respiratory machines, and all of that. And then from there, I moved on to then reflect on what can we draw from our taking seriously this act, which seems so natural, so obvious, and yet is not properly interrogated. And it strikes me that life is, it can be defined precisely. That's its first definition, I would say. The moment a baby comes out, for those of us who have attended that moment when a baby is born, the first thing is to find out whether he or she is able to breathe. So you tap a little bit, and then they cry, and you know that, okay, it's okay. So that originary act, which is at the beginning of life on earth, the moment you get out of the maternal envelope and you are given to the earth, the first thing we have to assess is whether or not you can breathe, whether or not you have access to this. We think it is an unlimited resource, but less and less, it will be less and less unlimited. So it seems that we could use that as a basis to reimagine what the right to life might be all about, especially at a time when the philosophical, political interrogation on life nowadays is more and more about how life ends. Yesterday it was how life starts. Where does it originate from? How to preserve it? More and more, the more I read, the more it seems to me that the debate is about how it ends. So if indeed we're on a trajectory towards the end of life, the question is, what do we do in order to sustain it? Which means, how do we share the earth? And how do we share the resources that allow all of us, all forms of living, to breathe? Because if you can't breathe, that's the end of it. I mean, we can't even be talking about anything else. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit too long, but I just wanted to take you with me as the thinking process went.
No, I think that one of the elements in your analysis that some way keeps this idea of the universal right to breathe in something which is more than a statement, but actually could also be a political program, actually, for the future, has to do with the centrality of the body that always had a central role in your analysis. It's some way the materiality of the body that transformed this statement into a political program. And I'm quoting from your text when you say, try as we might to rid ourselves of it, in the end, everything brings us back to the body. And a little further, you said, for just as there is no humanity without bodies, likewise, humanity will never know freedom alone outside of society and community, and never can freedom come at the expense of the biosphere. So the materiality of the body is what makes possible to transform this statement into a political program, I guess.
No, definitely. It strikes me that we have had we have been in a dramatic conflict with the body for a long time. It could be even argued that a huge part of our modernity has been about a confrontation with the human body in particular, both generally, but also, of course, situationally in very specific historical contexts with different trajectories and outcomes. So it strikes me, especially living here in South Africa and traveling around the continent, that it's simply impossible to be at war with the body. To be at war with the body means is the epitome of dispossession, or the impossibility to move when everyday survival depends on the coming together of as many bodies as possible in the open, which is a key difficulty we are facing here right now with confinement, that poor people who depend on the informal trade or sector, for instance, to make it from today to tomorrow, are at risk of dying of hunger before they die from COVID, which forces us to balance, between different forms of deaths. Is it better to die of COVID, in which case we keep confinement tight, or keeping the confinement tight will lead to death by other means, in this case from hunger? So I was talking to somebody the other day, and he was telling me, you know what, man, I met, he told me, oh, this COVID thing, by the time it reaches us, it won't have any work to do because hunger will have done the job. So I'm not sure what I'm coming up to, but I'm just sharing those impressions which keep bringing us back to the reality of the body. That somewhat we will have to make peace with the body. And when I say the body, it's not only the human body, it's the body of the world, it's the body of the earth, because of the interdependency, the biosymbiosis, which connect one to the other, that one will not survive at the expense of the other. So that was more or less so how do we rebuild democracy, for instance, political communities on that basis, was somewhat the exercise that I was trying to deal with.
So let me ask just another question before we eventually open to comments from those who are listening to us. So it seems to me that the materiality of the body in some way has its counterpart in the dematerialization of the computational logic you were mentioning before. So if on the one hand I understand the importance, the centrality of the materiality of the body, especially for I'm quoting, the possibility of sharing unconditionally, each time drawing from it something absolutely intrinsic, I think uncountable, incalculable, and priceless. So what you call the community, or better, the in common. On the other hand, personally, it seems to me that the critique of the digitalization, which is some way implicit in your argument, is a little bit too rigid. In that analysis, in the last few years, it has been also through these digital means that the possibility of gathering people or creating solidarities to also mobilize people, for instance, also for ecology and environmental fight has been possible. So, how do you see this digitalization of the world in relation with the possibility of the in common?
Yes. It's the next step. No, I'm not saying it to run away from a difficult question. but I'm absolutely serious about the fact that it will be the next step. In brutalism, in fact, brutalism, the book in French, hopefully soon in Italian, I started it as an attempt at rethinking anew some of what Heidegger wrote in his work on, it was called Concerning Technology and all that. In an age when the machine was the dominant form of the technological, and yet at a time also when the first experiments with cybernetics were just being put into place. So to some extent, but that's an aside comment, Heidegger's reading of technology is still very dependent on the age of the machine. Now the machine is still with us in many different forms, but we have also gone beyond the machine as such. We have now decisively moved into, sort of a better term, the computational, meaning the age when the hope is to download the living, the intelligent, downloading all of that into nano devices of all kinds. Nano devices which would then become a part and parcel of a new human who would not simply be human in the old sense of the term, or in any case, a new human who would be reconciled with the object, where personhood and objecthood would come together, fuse in a way that would render the human pliable, synthetic, and of course, more resilient in the sense of being able to live under extreme conditions. So that's the attempt, first of all, to map what actually is going on. The second moment which you point to is to make a judgment on all of that. And the difficulty I have, or I'm trying to deal with, is to not sound like a technophobe. I'm not a technophobe at all. I mean, I love. First of all, we wouldn't be here tonight if. Can you imagine COVID-19 before the online? I mean, it would have been absolutely a nightmare. So I totally don't want to sound like a technophobe, but nor do I want to sound like the term in French is technolâtre, like idolatry. I mean, technology as idolatry, if you want. So the point is to carve a fine line between these two positions, which I reject, and highlight the potentialities, the possibilities that these the advent of the computational age has made possible, not only in post-industrial societies, but also in societies such as ours in Africa, where not everybody has access to them. So how to do that while being mindful, of course, of all the developments we are witnessing right now in terms of the kind of political order that might emerge out of the COVID-19, the tracing of people, the surveillance, all these things many analysts are talking about. That's the dilemma. But I don't have anything definitive to say about that. It is the next step.
Thank you, Shir. So I would open the conversation to those who are listening to us. So I have a first question by Chiara Faini. She has, given the current situation of physical isolation, do you think it is still possible of talking about the borderization? What do you think borders would look like in the near future?
I don't know what they will look like. And I'm not joking, I really don't know. I haven't given much thought to this. I mean, it has been in the back of my mind because, as you know, I have been very much interested in, with many others, in these questions of the border, of borderization. And the border and borderization as metaphors of the organized violence that sustain our world. And I have been thinking about borders partly in the context of course, the emergence of all these new technologies, but also in the context of a question the infamous Carl Schmitt posed not so long ago. And it had to do with what he called the nomos of the earth. He didn't use the term the border. He understood one thing, which had to do with the fact that the world order we have inherited from key question. Whom does the world belong? To whom does the earth belong? That the world order we have inherited is the response to that prior, and borders play a key role, of course, in the partitioning of that world. I say the world is one way in which the question of who does belong to was resolved. But there are many other different responses. So when we say, to whom does it belong? We also, of course, have in mind all its inhabitants, humans, non-humans, of that, all its resources, who has the right to access them, use them, for what purpose, so forth and so on. So the reality, is, as seen from here, is that we are going to witness a geopolitical reorganization of the world. I'm not simply thinking about what's going on between the USA and China, which will probably determine the next 30, 40, 50 years, if not the rest of the century. that the rest of the century will be played out between, in terms of the rivalry between the United States of America and China, and the shift of the global to the east. But so when I talk about the great transition that has to be organized in Africa, it is from within that broader problematic. If we are to come back to the nation state as the primary caretaker of our health, our welfare, in times of catastrophe or in times of heightened risks, which will become the norm, that we will go from one risk to another. And the COVID, God help us, will pass, but something else will come after it. That will be going through cycles of exactly like in Africa, where, I mean, you go from crisis to crisis. And if the nation state is therefore to become the primary locus for in protecting life, allowing people to breathe, it means that we are likely to enter a new period of hypernationalism and competition for key resources, competition for access to basic equipment. All of that leaves us with broad questions we haven't thought about yet, it seems to me, and we should be really devoting a lot of our attention to that.
Okay, Achille. So now we have a question from our common friend Sandro Mezzadra, who writes, "Hi Achille, nice to see you. I was struck by what you said regarding the becoming neurological of capitalism, with the brain as the new unlimited raw material. How do you connect the universal right to breathe with the operations of this neurological capitalism?"
I mean, at first, it's not a it's a paradoxical relationship. Follow us the link. Can you hear me?
I had some problem. I don't know if the other people can hear. Would you mind repeating your?
I will repeat it. First of all, I thank Sandro. I wish I could see him. And I'm wondering how his work is going. I know he was on a fabulous project when we last saw him in Bologna. I hope it's working well. I have been reading Sandro, of course, on these questions of migration, and I have learned a lot from it. Now he's asking me a very difficult question, and one way of running away from it is to say the relationship will be very paradoxical. But I'm not joking when I say that. I have in mind, for instance, I was reading a few days ago a piece by, I can't remember her name, but it's a young researcher from Harvard who has just published last year a book called Carceral Capitalism. It's an amazing piece of work, which is centered around the history of her brother, who, of course, lived in the ghetto in America and all that, who stole some beer in a shop, and of course entered the U.S. criminal system, which is extremely repressive in terms of poor and racialized people who happen to be caught in those things we would believe, I mean, steal a beer was a problem. But he entered that process and ended up in a situation where he had to sell his plasma in order to not only survive, but also in order to avoid being jailed for a very, very, very long time. I just want to highlight that moment, the selling of human fluids. In plasma is a very precious resource. Not everyone has access to it. It's very costly in the USA in view of the calamitous public health system we know about. So here we are not dealing with neurology as such. We are dealing with fluids. So it's a new form of capitalism that will not only be premised on what's happening in the brain or what's happening in the psyche, but which will find new forms of depleting the bodies which otherwise are considered as not mattering. So what I'm saying is that, in fact, what capitalism is discovering is that all bodies do matter. They do matter at some point, depending on what in their constitution, what keeps them alive, one is trying to extract. Extraction here being more or less the same as depleting. So I use that term depletion in brutalism precisely to begin to open up a space for, let's say, the kinds of questions Sandro is asking, which of course require more work and elaboration.
Thank you, Achille. So now we have Hafsa Marak. I would like to know what Professor Mbembe think about the debate raised in France by two doctors, Jean-Paul Mirat and Camille Lochet, who proposed to experiment the vax for COVID-19 in Africa, perpetuating a colonialist image of Africa even in this situation.
But what do you want me to say? I mean, I don't really have much to say about it. These are killers, really. I mean, what else? How else could we call them? Look, there's not much to say about it. We know what it's all about, and we just have to call it out and then oppose it. If there's a vaccine to be found, we should imagine that it could be experimented on any one of us, and not only on one specific racialized group, and that's it.
Okay, thank you, Achille. So now we have, we are approaching the end of our conversation, so I will get the last two questions for you. So Cosimo Gragnani, he writes, here in Italy, during this pandemic, at first immigrants were disappeared from public and political discourse, and then reappeared in fake news and other irrational discourses about immigrants that represent them as immune to the virus, for example. So such irrational discourses made me think about the relation you made in Politique de l'inimité between phobia of the other and the magical thought. Could we talk about racism in terms of witchcraft?
No, it's not. I'm laughing because I like the turn of from within that frame of witchcraft. So I take the idea as a very creative, proactive subject. If we look into witchcraft as the kind of aggression because witchcraft is a theory of aggression. but the kind of aggression that comes from within, within meaning from those who are close to you, family members, those you share your life with, then immigrants in that dispensation can be thought of as those who are next to us or with us, but not like us. Immigrants force us to rethink what it means, what the intimate sphere is all about. And therefore understood as vectors of aggression. What kind of aggression, what kind of vectors would have to deconstruct all of that. But just take it as a hypothesis one can play with in an interesting manner. What would it yield? I'm not sure, but I'm willing to play with it.
So we have our last question by Valentina Antoniol. Good evening. As you define, necropolitics entails the subjugation of life to the power of death. It implies the use of power to decide how some people may live and how some must die. Do you think this concept would be useful to describe some aspect of the political and social management of COVID-19 emergence? Could you please further conceptualize possible applications of this concept in relation to the current situation? Thank you.
I was hoping to escape that, that one. Okay. Because the tendency has been, since this whole thing started, for a number of us to just open our little suitcase, find whatever we had before, and dump it on something which is, as Raffaele was really reminding us at the beginning, something which is pretty new, which is pretty unprecedented. And it doesn't seem to me that that's the best way to account for what is going on, because most of those concepts were invented before this happened. I mean, they might or might not apply. That's not the issue, but it's an event that calls for new theoretical imaginations. I would think. So I'm reluctant to read what's going on in terms of what was described 20 years ago as necropolitics, which was basically related to the new kind of age we entered in the aftermath of 9/11. We are all, since we're speaking in Italy, all aware of what has happened to Agamben recently when he tried to say something about all of this. Taught us a little lesson, and I don't really want to fall into that trap. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Achille. So we arrived at the end of our conversation. Before saying goodbye to Achille, let me remind our next public dialogue next Monday at 6:30 p.m. We will discuss with David Quammen. And I want to thank, as usual, Margherita Caprilli, Flavia Tommasini, and the staff of the Foundation for making possible this public dialogue. And of course, a special thanks to my dear friend Achille for getting the time to discuss with us tonight. Thank you, Achille, and hope to see you soon.
No, definitely. Thanks so much. Thanks. Take care. And thanks to everybody. Bye.